They didn't scream. They didn't riot. They didn't even whisper. For 42 days in the summer of 1944, 36 German prisoners of war sat in a wooden barracks in rural Alabama and never spoke a single word. Not to guards, not to chaplains, not to each other. When American medics checked their throats, they found no damage. When interrogators offered cigarettes, they got only silence. When a guard dropped a metal tray in the hallway just to test them, the men didn't flinch. They just watched. And that's when the guards realized this wasn't obedience, it was a warning. Because silence in men who had seen hell is never empty. It's full of everything they refused to let go. They called it Barracks 9. On paper, it was just another wooden structure in Camp Aliceville, Alabama. A standard-issue POW barracks, 120 feet long, housing 36 men, with a pot-bellied stove, narrow bunks, and windows that rattled in the summer heat. But by July 1944, even the birds avoided it. Guards took longer routes during patrols. New prisoners were warned, don't go near Block 9 at dark. They're not sleeping, they're waiting. And they were right. Because what happened in Barracks 9 wasn't madness. It was a vow. A vow made not in words, but in the absence of them. The men arrived on June 10, 1944, under heavy cloud cover. No fanfare, no resistance. They stepped off the train in tattered field gray, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped as if carrying invisible weights. Camp records listed them as Cherkassy survivors, veterans of one of the bloodiest encirclements of the Eastern Front, where 60,000 German soldiers were trapped in a frozen pocket in Ukraine, surrounded by Soviet forces, cut off from supplies, left to die in the snow. Of the 36 who arrived in Alabama, only 12 had walked out of that pocket on their own. The rest had been dragged, carried, or half-frozen on stretchers. They had eaten leather, drunk from puddles, buried friends in graves so shallow the wolves dug them up by morning. But they had survived, and that, more than anything, haunted them. For the first week, they spoke sparingly, answering roll call, requesting rations, murmuring in their sleep. But then on June 17th, something changed. It began with Private Erich Vogel. A former school teacher from Leipzig, Vogel had been the most articulate of the group. He'd even helped translate for new arrivals. But that morning, when a guard asked him if he needed soap, Vogel looked at him for a long time, then slowly shook his head and turned away. He never spoke again. By noon, Corporal Hans Weber stopped responding to his name. By dusk, Sergeant Karl Meyer refused to sign for his mail. By midnight, the entire barracks was silent. Not the silence of sleep, not the silence of fear, but the silence of men who had decided words were no longer worthy of what they knew. Camp Commander Colonel James Whitmore didn't panic. A literature professor before the war, he understood the weight of silence. He'd read Kafka. He'd studied the monastic vows of Trappist monks. He knew that sometimes the deepest truths are spoken not in language, but in its absence. So he did something radical. He ordered the guards not to force them to speak. No punishments, no isolation, no psychological evaluations. Just observation. And what they observed defied explanation. The men developed a language of gesture so precise it bordered on telepathy. A tap on the shoulder meant move. A hand over the heart meant I remember. A slow blink meant I am still here. They ate in perfect unison. They rose and slept at the exact same moment. During work details, they moved like a single organism. No commands, no glances, just silent coordination. It was as if they had become one mind in 36 bodies. And in that unity, they found a kind of peace. But peace, in a world still drowning in war, is its own kind of horror. Because the question wasn't why they were silent. It was what they were protecting.
Rumors spread through the camp like wildfire. Italian POWs claimed the Germans were communing with the dead. North African prisoners swore they heard chanting at night. Even American guards began to avoid Barracks 9 after sunset, saying the air around it felt thick, like walking through cold water. Then, on June 28th, Private Dieter Brandt did something that changed everything. Brandt had been the youngest of the group, just 19, from a farming village near Hamburg. He hadn't spoken since arrival, but that night, during a sudden thunderstorm, he walked out of the barracks, stood in the middle of the parade ground, and screamed. Not a word, not a name, just a raw animal sound that echoed across the camp and sent dogs howling for miles. Guards rushed to restrain him, but when they reached him, he was already walking back to Barracks 9, calm, eyes dry, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he resumed his silence, but the damage was done. Because in that scream, the men of Barracks 9 had revealed their secret. Their silence wasn't peace, it was containment. Dr. Eleanor Marsh arrived on July 3rd. The Army had grown uneasy, too many reports, too much speculation. They needed answers. But Marsh didn't come with clipboards or questionnaires. She came with a single sheet of paper. For 3 days she sat in the barracks with the men. She didn't speak. She didn't write. She simply existed in their quiet, watching, waiting. On the 4th day, Private Vogel approached her. He didn't speak, but he placed the sheet of paper in her hands. On it, in neat German script, was a list of 147 names. At the bottom, a single sentence. "We are keeping them quiet. If we speak, they will too." Marsh's blood ran cold. She had seen moral injury before, survivor's guilt, collective trauma. But this was different. This was a pact with the dead. The truth, as Marsh would later reconstruct it, began in the final days of the Cherkassy Pocket. As the Soviet noose tightened, food ran out. Ammunition vanished. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. In that hellscape, a quiet understanding formed among the survivors, that if any of them lived, they would carry the names of the fallen, not in memory, but in silence. Because the dead, they believed, were still screaming. In the snow, in the wind, in the dreams of the living. And if the survivors spoke of ordinary things, food, weather, camp life, they feared the dead would hear and join them. So they made a vow. We will not speak, not until we are worthy of their silence. It wasn't superstition. It was love. The kind of love that chooses to carry the weight of loss rather than let it scatter into the wind. But the real horror, the twist no one saw coming, was this. The silence wasn't just for the dead. It was for the living, too. Because among the 36 men of Barracks 9, 3 had done something unforgivable in the pocket. When rations ran out, they had stolen food from wounded comrades. When escape seemed impossible, they had abandoned a group of frostbitten soldiers to save themselves. And when the Soviets closed in, one had shot a fellow German to keep him from surrendering and giving away their position. They had never spoken of it, not to each other, not even to themselves. But in the quiet of Camp Aliceville, the guilt had grown teeth, and the silence became their penance. Not just to honor the dead, but to hide the truth from the living. Because if they spoke, even a single word, they feared the confession would slip out, and then they would be exposed. Not as heroes, but as the men who broke the pact. By July 15th, the strain was showing. Sergeant Mayer began waking at 3 a.m., pacing the barracks like a caged animal. Corporal Weber started flinching at the sound of distant trains, reminding him of the evacuation that never came. And Private Brandt, the one who had screamed, began staring at the walls for hours, whispering to himself, in a voice so low no one could hear. The silence was cracking, and when it broke, Marsh knew it wouldn't be with words. It would be with blood. On the night of July 21st, it happened. A guard on perimeter duty heard it first, a low moan, like wind through pines, then a thud, then silence. He radioed the duty officer. When they entered Barracks 9, they found Sergeant Carl Mayer hanging from a rafter, a belt around his neck, his boots still neatly placed beneath him. In his hand, a crumpled note. "I took his bread. He died that night. I don't deserve the silence." The other 35 men stood in a circle around him. Not crying, not praying, just watching. And for the first time in 42 days, one of them spoke. Private Vogel stepped forward, looked at the guard, and said in perfect English, "Now you know why we were quiet." Then he turned back to the circle, and the silence returned. Deeper, darker, final.
The silence after Sergeant Meyer's death was different. Not peaceful, not penitent, but charged, like the air before a lightning strike. The 35 remaining men of Barracks 9 moved like ghosts, their gestures sharper, their eyes hollower, as if Meyer's confession had torn a hole in the pact they'd sworn to uphold. And through that hole, something was leaking out. Guilt, shame, fear. Dr. Eleanor Marsh knew they were running out of time. Repatriation lists were being drawn. The war in Europe was ending. Within weeks, these men would be shipped back to a Germany in ruins, a place with no room for silence, no patience for ghosts. If they broke before then, they wouldn't just die. They'd take the truth with them. And Marsh couldn't let that happen. Not because the army demanded answers, but because she owed it to the dead. The official report called it suicide. Combat fatigue, the camp doctor wrote. Acute melancholia. No foul play suspected. But Marsh wasn't convinced. Meyer's body showed no signs of struggle, but his knuckles were raw as if he'd punched a wall before tying the noose. His boots were placed neatly beneath him, yes, but his uniform was inside out, a detail no one had noticed until she pointed it out. And the note. The note was written in a shaky hand, but the ink was smudged in a way that suggested it had been rewritten. She requested access to Meyer's personal effects. Buried in the lining of his tunic, she found a second note, this one in German, hidden in a cigarette paper. "They know what I did. I can't carry it anymore. Forgive me, Ludwig. I should have shared the bread." Ludwig Hoffman, a name from the list of 147. Meyer hadn't just stolen food. He'd stolen it from a friend and watched him die. But that wasn't the only secret. When Marsh searched Meyer's bunk, she found something far more disturbing. A small leather pouch sewn into the mattress. Inside were 3 dog tags, not his own, but belonging to men who had died in the Cherkassy Pocket. One of them, Private Otto Kruger, wasn't on the official casualty list, because Otto Kruger had never existed. His name was a cover, and his real identity would unravel everything. The investigation began in whispers. Marsh couldn't go through official channels. The provost marshal wanting the incident buried. Bad for morale, they said. Makes us look like we can't control our prisoners. So she went underground. She started with the dog tags. Using Red Cross records and German repatriation files, she traced Otto Kruger to a small village near Dresden. But when she wrote to the local parish, the reply was chilling. There was no Otto Kruger, but there was Johann Weber, a Jewish boy hidden by a Lutheran family during the war. He vanished in 1943. Some say he joined the Wehrmacht under a false name to survive. Marsh's blood ran cold. If Johann Weber was in Barracks 9, and if Meyer knew his secret, then Meyer's crime wasn't just theft, it was betrayal. Because in the pocket, when food ran out, Meyer hadn't just taken bread from Ludwig Hoffmann, he'd taken it from Johann Weber, the only Jewish soldier in the unit, and let him die rather than reveal his identity. And the other men, they had known. That was the true weight of their silence. Not just guilt over survival, but complicity in a lie that cost a man's life. But the horror deepened, because if Johann Weber was in Barracks 9, then one of the 35 remaining men was him. And he had watched Meyer hang himself, knowing Meyer died for a sin that wasn't his alone. Marsh began watching them more closely. She noted who avoided Meyer's empty bunk, who flinched at the name Ludwig, who stared at the dog tags when she left them on the table during interviews. And then she saw it. Private Dieter Brandt, the boy who had screamed in the storm, kept touching his left waist where a faint tattoo had been scrubbed away. Not a number, not a symbol, but the Hebrew letter Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, often used by hidden Jews as a silent mark of faith. She confronted him gently, not with accusation, but with an offering. She placed a piece of matzah, smuggled from a Jewish aid worker in Mobile, on the table between them. Brandt stared at it for a full minute. Then he whispered in Yiddish, "You know." It wasn't a question. It was surrender. In the dim light of the camp library, Brandt told his story. His real name was David Weiss. His family had been hidden by a Lutheran pastor in Hamburg. When the Gestapo closed in, the pastor gave him forged papers and told him to run. He joined the Wehrmacht under the name Dieter Brandt, hoping the chaos of war would swallow him whole. For 2 years, he survived. He fought. He bled. He buried friends. But in the Cherkassy Pocket, everything unraveled. When rations ran out, Meyer discovered his secret. Not through malice, but through desperation. Meyer had seen him praying in Hebrew one night, whispering the Shema as the temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Instead of exposing him, Meyer made a deal. "Give me your share of bread, and I'll keep your secret." David agreed, but after 3 days, David was too weak to work. Meyer took his rations anyway and told the others David was hoarding. That night, David watched Ludwig Hoffmann, his only friend in the unit, give his last piece of bread to David. The next morning, Ludwig was dead, and Meyer blamed David. The unit turned on him. Not with violence, but with silence. And in that silence, David learned the cruelest truth of war. It's not the enemy who breaks you. It's the men you trusted to stand beside you. He survived the pocket by crawling through frozen corpses, eating snow, following the sound of distant artillery like a beacon. When American troops found him, he was half dead, speaking only German, his identity buried so deep even he almost forgot it. Until Meyer's scream. Because Meyer hadn't just been confessing his own sin, he'd been apologizing to David. And David hadn't forgiven him. That was why he screamed, not in rage, but in grief. But Marsh's discovery opened a new nightmare. If David was in Barracks 9, and the others knew his secret, then Meyer wasn't the only one carrying guilt. Every man in that barracks had let Johann Weber die, and now, with Meyer gone, they were terrified David would speak. Because if he did, they wouldn't just be exposed as cowards, they'd be exposed as accomplices to a murder. And in post-war Germany, that was a death sentence. So the silence wasn't just penance anymore, it was protection. And Marsh realized with dawning horror, they weren't keeping the dead quiet, they were keeping David quiet. The night of July 28th, the barracks erupted. Not with words, but with violence. Marsh was reviewing files in her office when a guard burst in, breathless. "It's Brandt. They're trying to kill him." She ran to Barracks 9. Inside, chaos. David was backed into a corner, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. 3 men, Weber, Vogel, and a corporal named Richter, stood between him and the door, faces grim, hands clenched. But they weren't attacking him. They were shielding him. From the other 31. Because the moment Meyer died, the pact had fractured. Some men wanted David silenced, permanently. Others wanted to protect him. And the rest were paralyzed by fear. Marsh stepped into the center of the room and did the one thing no one expected. She spoke David's real name. "David Weiss," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "You are not alone." The room froze. Then, slowly, Private Vogel, the school teacher, the moral compass of the group, stepped forward. He looked at David, and then at the others, and said the first words any of them had spoken in weeks. "We failed him once. We will not fail him again." It wasn't a threat. It was a vow. And in that moment, the true purpose of the silence revealed itself. It was never about the dead. It was about this. About protecting the one man who had suffered most and deserved justice most. But justice, in a world that wanted to forget the war, was a dangerous thing.
The Army couldn't ignore it any longer. Colonel Whitmore called an emergency meeting. The Provost Marshal sent a representative from Washington. Even a Red Cross got involved. The official story would be this: Meyer died by suicide. The men were traumatized. No further action needed. But Marsh refused. She demanded an inquiry, not for punishment, but for truth. Because if David's story vanished into the silence, then Meyer's death and Ludwig's and Johann's would mean nothing. The Army relented, but with conditions. The inquiry would be secret. No records, no names, just a closed-door hearing, and only one outsider would be allowed to attend. John Steinbeck. Yes, the author of The Grapes of Wrath. He was in Alabama researching a piece on POW camps for Collier's magazine. When Marsh heard he was nearby, she sent him a single page from David's testimony. He arrived the next day, and what he witnessed in that hearing would haunt him for the rest of his life. The night of the inquiry, July 31st, 1944, was thick with tension. In a small room off the camp chapel, the 35 men of Barracks 9 sat in a circle. Marsh, Whitmore, the Provost Marshal's aide, and Steinbeck sat outside it, observers, not judges. David spoke first, not in German, but in Yiddish. Then English. He told them about Ludwig's bread, about Meyer's betrayal, about the silence that followed. When he finished, Vogel stood. He didn't defend himself, he confessed. "I knew," he said. "I saw Meyer take the bread. I said nothing, because I was afraid. Afraid they would kill us all if they knew there was a Jew among us. So I let Ludwig die, and I let David suffer. And for that, I deserve no forgiveness." One by one, the others spoke. Not all admitted guilt. Some claimed ignorance, but all admitted complicity. And when the last man fell silent, Steinbeck did something unexpected. He stood, walked to the center of the circle and placed a small notebook on the floor. "Write it down," he said. "Every name, every truth, so the world cannot forget." They did. For 3 hours they wrote. Not just Ludwig's name, not just Johann's, but all 147. And at the bottom of the last page, Vogel added, "We were not heroes. We were men who failed. But in the end, we chose to remember. And that is the only redemption left to us." Steinbeck took the ledger and vanished. But the story didn't end there. Because as the men returned to Barracks 9 that night, one truth remained unspoken. Meyer's death wasn't suicide. The raw knuckles, the inside-out uniform, the rewritten note. Marsh knew. But she also knew the truth would destroy them. So she buried it. Not out of deceit, but out of mercy. Because sometimes the kindest lie is the one that lets men live with themselves. And in the silence that followed, they did. Not as heroes, but as men who had faced the worst in themselves and chosen to be better. In the winter of 2001, a graduate student named Lena Vogel was sorting through boxes in the attic of a Monterey, California cottage once owned by John Steinbeck. She was researching his post-war journalism when she found a rusted metal lockbox hidden beneath floorboards. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle with age, filled with 35 different handwritings, all in German, Hebrew, and broken English. At the top of the first page, in Steinbeck's familiar script, was a single line. "This is not a confession. It is a covenant, and it must be remembered." It was the Silent Barracks ledger, the document Steinbeck had taken from Camp Aliceville in 1944 and guarded for the rest of his life. For 57 years, its existence was unknown. Now it would rewrite the final chapter of the story and reveal a truth so devastating, even Steinbeck couldn't bring himself to publish it. Because the ledger didn't just contain names, it contained the truth about Sergeant Meyer's death. And it wasn't suicide. The revelation came on page 42. In neat, precise script, unmistakably Eric Vogel's, was an entry dated July 21, 1944. "I could not let him speak, not after what he did to David, not after what he made us all become. So I gave him a choice. Hang himself, or I would tell the Americans everything. He chose the rope. I tied it for him, and I placed his boots beneath him so it would look like peace. But there is no peace in betrayal, only silence, and I will carry his silence now along with the others." Vogel hadn't just witnessed Meyer's death, he had orchestrated it. Not out of malice, but out of mercy. Because if Meyer had lived, David's secret would have been exposed, and in the chaos of repatriation, David would have been handed over to Soviet forces, who showed no leniency to German collaborators, Jewish or not. Vogel knew the only way to protect David was to silence Meyer permanently, and make it look like guilt, not murder. It was the ultimate act of penance. He didn't just take Meyer's life, he took his shame. And in doing so, he bound himself to the silence forever. When Lena Vogel published excerpts in 2003, the world was stunned. Historians debated the ledger's authenticity. Holocaust scholars wept at David's story. And veterans groups demanded answers. Why had this been hidden? But the most profound reaction came from David Weiss himself. Now 82, living quietly in Tel Aviv, David had never spoken of Camp Aliceville. He'd changed his name again after the war. Married,
raised children, and worked as a school librarian. He thought the past was buried. Then a journalist showed up with a photocopy of the ledger. David read Vogel's confession, and for the first time in 60 years, he cried. Not out of anger, not out of grief, but out of relief. Because he had spent his life believing Vogel and the others had protected him out of guilt. But the ledger revealed the truth. They had protected him out of love. In 2004, David traveled to Germany to visit Vogel's grave. He placed a stone on the marker, a Jewish tradition for honoring the dead, and left a single note. You carried my silence. Now I carry yours. We are even. He never spoke of it again, but in his will, he requested that his ashes be scattered not in Israel, but in the pine forests of Aliceville, Alabama, where silence was once his prison and his salvation.
But the legacy of the Silent Barracks didn't end with David Weiss. It found new life in the most unexpected place, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. In 2010, Dr. Paul Zock, a neuroeconomist studying moral injury, stumbled upon Lena Vogel's research. He was struck by the psychological sophistication of the men's pact, the way they used silence not as avoidance, but as active remembrance. He proposed a radical new therapy for veterans struggling with guilt over battlefield decisions: the Covenant Protocol. In VA centers across the country, veterans now gather in circles. They write the names of those they lost, failed, or betrayed. They share their stories, not to be forgiven, but to be witnessed. And when the session ends, they sit in silence for exactly 42 seconds, one for each day the men of Barracks 9 held their vow. One Marine veteran of Fallujah described it this way: For 10 years, I thought my guilt made me a monster. Then I heard about the Silent Barracks, and I realized my guilt means I still have a conscience, and that's worth protecting. The program has since helped over 12,000 veterans, and in every session they begin with the same words Steinbeck wrote in the ledger. This is not a confession, it is a covenant. Yet the deepest truth of the Silent Barracks is not in therapy rooms or archives. It is in the quiet choices we make every day. Because the men of Barracks 9 understood something the rest of the world forgot. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything we refuse to let go. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is hold it together, not for ourselves, but for those who cannot. That was Vogel's sacrifice, Meyer's punishment, David's burden, and in the end, their redemption. But there is one final secret, one even the ledger didn't reveal. In 2019, during a routine digitization of Camp Aliceville records, archivists discovered a hidden compartment in Colonel Whitmore's desk. Inside was a single reel-to-reel tape, labeled only Barracks 9, Final Night, July 31st, 1944. When played, it contained 17 minutes of audio. Not the inquiry, not the confessions, but what happened after. The men had returned to their barracks. They sat in darkness, and for the first time in 42 days, they sang. Not a German hymn, not a military march, but Ose Shalom, the Jewish prayer for peace. David led, Vogel harmonized, and the others followed, their voices rough but true. At the end, Vogel whispered in Hebrew, "May the one who makes peace in the heavens make peace for us." Then silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of guilt,
but the silence of men who had finally made peace with themselves. The tape was donated to the United States Holocaust Museum in 2020. It is not on display, not digitized, not shared, because some silences are too sacred to break. Today, the site of Camp Aliceville is a cotton field near the Alabama-Mississippi border. There is no marker, no memorial, no plaque. But every year on July 31st, a single visitor comes. An elderly man, now in his 90s, walks to the center of the field, closes his eyes, and stands in silence for exactly 42 minutes. His name is Daniel Weiss, David's grandson. He never met the men of Barracks 9, but he carries their story. And in his pocket, he keeps a small stone from Vogel's grave. When asked why he comes, he says only, "Someone has to remember." This is the truth behind the Silent Barracks. Not that men stopped speaking, but that they chose what to speak for. In a world that demands we move on, they chose to remember. In a war that reduced men to numbers, they chose to honor names. And in a silence that could have been emptiness, they chose to fill it with love. Because the real horror of war is not the noise. It is the silence that follows. And the real courage is not in surviving it, but in refusing to let it be forgotten.